Afternoon, everyone. I'm going to call this meeting to order. Bienvenue à la réunion.
Welcome to meeting number 47 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics.
De la Chambre de Commune. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23, 2022, and therefore members can attend in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Should any technical challenges arise, please advise me. Please note that we may need to suspend a few minutes as we need to ensure that all members are able to fully participate. And conformément à l'article
Pursuant to Standing Order 1083H and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, May 16, 2022, the committee is resuming its study of access to information and privacy system.
In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, I am informing the committee that all witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting. And I'd now like to welcome our witnesses today, both as individuals, Mr. Michael Wernick, the Jerry Lowsky Chair in Public Sector Management, I hope I said that right, University of Ottawa, and from the Glacier Media Group, Mr. Kirk Lapointe, Vice President, Editorial, Publisher, and Editor-in-Chief Business in Vancouver. Je vous dis bienvenue.
Welcome to Mr. Savard as well, who is representing the Bloc Québécois today, and Mr. Julian for the NDP.
Sir, the floor is yours, followed by Mr. Lapointe.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee for inviting me. I would like to say hello to Kirk, and I am pleased to share this time with him.
Biography, I'm sure the clerk can provide it for you, and anybody can find me on LinkedIn or Wikipedia. I left government about 3 years ago, more than 3 years ago, but I do continue an interest in public sector management from my role at the University of Ottawa. I'll say right away that I have not spoken to anyone inside the government about my appearance today or my testimony. I haven't read any of the other briefs to the committee or transcripts of appearances, so I don't know what other advice you've been getting or will have to sort out. I was a senior executive in the federal government for 28 years. I was at the deputy minister level for 17. About half that time I worked for Liberal governments, about half the time I worked for Conservative governments. So I offer the committee some experience and perspective on how access to information impacts the work of the federal public service, how it works in practice, and some suggestions on how it could be improved. My views on ATIP are on the record. They're set out in detail in a 1-hour video on YouTube posted by World Press Freedom Canada. I was pleased to participate in a debate that they sponsored on access to information in September 2021. Members may have missed it because you were out campaigning for the election held 2 weeks later. In the interest of brevity, I did send a written statement to the clerk last Thursday, which I hope has been circulated to you, and I don't propose to read it all today. The really short form of the main points I'd like to leave you with today are as follows. 1, the request-based regime in 1980s ATIP is just not enough. The Act should be expanded to become a Transparency Act for the 2020s and 2030s. The Commissioner should be restyled as a Transparency Commissioner and given a broad mandate to examine and make recommendations regarding transparency practices across the entire federal public sector, including the public service, all Crown corporations, Parliament itself, and the courts. 2, there is nothing that would stop a government now or in future from curtailing or rolling back or making exceptions from transparency practices that have built up over the last 10 or 15 years. To make that more painful, the Act should be expanded now, before the next election, to contain a robust statutory obligation to routine, regular, proactive disclosure of a long list of information categories, which I set out in my brief, so that there can be no backsliding after October 2025. 3, the entire access regime should apply to any taxpayer-funded staff in ministers' offices, including the Prime Minister's office, to create a completely level playing field between political staff and public servants. 4, There is no way that a request-based model of accessing information and indeed protection of privacy can perform well unless governments will finally take seriously and invest in the storage, management, and retrieval of records. No government ever does that, and the state of records management in the federal government is shambolic. To start the long, hard work required to fix this mess, the Act should be expanded to contain reporting and feedback loops that force the government of the day to pay attention and report progress to Canadians and indeed to this committee. And 5, the concept of duty to document is one of those things that sounds good if you say it fast enough, but would not work in practice, and it could have harmful and unintended consequences. As a former Secretary to Cabinet and Clerk of the Privy Council, who had responsibility for 3 years for the Cabinet process and Cabinet papers, I'm eager to speak about issues around Cabinet confidences and the deliberations of Cabinet and its committees. I've set out my views on Cabinet government in some detail in my 2021 book, Governing Canada, and it certainly came up in the debate hosted by World Press Freedom last September. The short version of my message is it would not be in the public interest to make it harder for Cabinet to deliberate and take decisions. So with that lead out of the way, I will be pleased to take questions from the committee. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Wernick. Mr. Lapointe, you have 5 minutes to address the committee. Sir, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good to see Michael Wernick today. Thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss access to information reform with you today. I'm Kirk Lapointe. I'm the publisher and the editor-in-chief of Business in Vancouver, the business news outlet in British Columbia, vice president of editorial for the Glacier Media chain of news outlets, the largest in Western Canada. I also teach ethics and leadership in the journalism program as an adjunct professor at University of British Columbia. Part of my role in instruction is in freedom of information law, as are, of course, part of my duties as an editor. My familiarity with ATIP dates back to my roles in the 1980s and 90s in Ottawa as bureau chief of the Canadian Press and host on CBC News Network, then known as CBC News World. I've advocated strong use of ATIP in news operations I've run at CP, then at Southam News, the Hamilton Spectator, CTV News, and the Vancouver Sun, now at Glacier Media. I personally filed more than 3,000 requests, and newsrooms I've managed have filed well more than 15,000. I approach ATIP not as an opportunity to scandalize government of the day, but as an important instrument for the public we serve to understand our history, the decision-making of those who serve us, and the inherent complexities, challenges, and dilemmas of public administration. The work I've done has shed light on everything from cabinet discussions on the War Measures Act, value for money evaluations across a range of departmental programs, to the expenses to operate our official residences, and much more. My lens has been what I subjectively consider the public interest, and my instrument has been a law that I believed would illuminate the operation of government. Until Bill C-58, that belief took several steps backward. Recent reforms to the law have made progress in recapturing some of the original spirit of the law as envisioned by Jed Baldwin, the Conservative MP I knew in my earlier days in the national capital, but there remains a very long road ahead to fulfill his vision. Too often in its history, users of the law have been made to feel they are being done a favor to exercise their right to know. Delays and denials have stretched credulity. Too many public servants have seen their role as protecting bureaucracy and political masters. Technology now permits the footprint of history to be erased and overwritten. Significant investments in the vast apparatus of their own communications by successive governments in a form of self-congratulatory vanity press have far outweighed any investment in ATIP. I've been assisted in my perspective in the last decade by running for municipal office here in Vancouver in the mayoralty race, and it might surprise you that I've gained a fuller appreciation of the perspective of the politician and the public and media environment that correctly gives rise in the era of social media to a defensiveness and a guardedness, to a lack of candor and a lack of acknowledgement of errors in judgment or decisions that went awry. So I think I can speak more knowledgeably about where you sit, what conditions you endure, and how it might affect what you wish to share with the public. I can understand the fear that comes with any environment of extensive disclosure because it comes with admitting mistakes. And of course, everyone makes mistakes. That's why there are erasers on pencils. Even the Pope has given up on the claim of infallibility. But I would hope that you would also understand my appeal to the bigger picture, because the defensive culture of communications is a prime contributor to the suspicion and the cynicism in our political systems that can give rise to the most vulgar of our social media and to appallingly low voter turnouts and participation in political parties. In denying access to the critical pathology of public policy, to the process of decision-making, media must resort to picking at the bones instead of the meat, which in turn cheapens our craft and our image. A few reforms might address both. My own modest reform recommendations for advancement of the law arise from many of the basic impediments I've experienced. First, there has to be an investment in resources to limit the delays in responding to requests. And if government professes to subscribe to openness, it should also tell the public how much it spends on its own promotional publicity and communications, then link that spending to the spending on providing better access to information service. Proactivity is an important ingredient, but C58 only takes baby steps. Any reform ought to require proactive disclosure of a range of information in government, including internally conducted department audits 30 days after their completion, while the paint is still fresh, to understand in something approaching real time whether programs are actually value for money. A second proactive area would include the simultaneous release of records, studies, correspondence, research, advocacy that prepared departments and their ministers for policy announcements or the introduction of legislation, with an exemption, of course, for Privy Council confidences. For that matter, all contracted services to government ought to be subjected to the Act's purview. It is time for the blackout period on Queen's Privy Council records to be at most 15 years instead of 20, as is the case in my own province of British Columbia, or even 10. The longest political reign of my lifetime, of Lester Pearson and Pierre Trudeau, barely reached 15 years. Disclosure of minutes and records from their earliest date would rarely touch upon a sitting administration, but the relevance of information withers with time. And my last recommendation for this review would see this committee call out the abuses of the letter and spirit of the law across the public service, the use of personal email or encrypted apps for government communication, oral briefings instead of written reports, the vesting of copyright with contractors to avoid disclosure, among many other things. Reforming this law can't extend into these traits, but a recommendation of a review of public service law could curtail these chronic problems. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Lapointe, and I'm glad that Mr. Wernick had an extra minute to give you so you can get that last recommendation in. It worked out well for the committee. Here's what I'm proposing. We've got two qualified witnesses. I don't expect that we're going to have any interruptions today, so what I'm proposing is the first round, 6 minutes each, obviously. Second round, 5 minutes each, and then the potential for a third round, 5, 5, 2.5, 2.5. If everyone is okay with that, then we can continue. Okay, there may be a need not to continue on with that round, but that's what I'm proposing today. So with that, we're going to go to Mr. Couric first for 6 minutes. Mr. Couric.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for coming and speaking to this committee. Really appreciate your expertise and experience, and my encouragement, as always is the case, is, and I know for sure, Mr. Wernick, you had mentioned that you'd sent a brief in, but to Mr. Lapointe as well. Please feel free to send further details to this committee so that we can do everything we can to try and build a substantive report at its conclusion. So thank you in advance for that. A question to both of you, and I've started each round that each round of witnesses asking this question, and it's simple: is a effective access to information regime essential for a modern democracy? Starting with you, Mr. Wernick. You're on mute.
Yes, of course. I don't think I need the rest of the time. I think I would just point out as I.
And sorry, Mr. Lapointe.
There's feedback coming. So let me try. I'm hearing feedback from the floor. Should I try again?
You answered the question perfectly, Mr. Lapointe. To you.
Unquestionably. I would say that particularly in light of an increased context in which governments are becoming more and more sophisticated at controlling messaging, that the public has an opportunity as part of its democratic exercise to avail itself of a right to know, and largely things that government don't wish on any given day to necessarily disclose.
Yeah. So the next question that I would ask, and just a yes or no, or maybe a couple of seconds expansion, just to keep it short, to Mr. Wernick first, and then to Mr. Lapointe. Is Canada's system adequate? Yes or no?
No. I do hope we're going to actually get to speak at a little bit more length about these issues.
Well,
but no, of course not.
We'll get there. Don't worry.
It gets from the 1980s, and I said in my opening statement, we need a transparency law for the 2020s and 2030s.
Okay. And Mr. Lapointe?
No.
Thank you very much for that. Mr. Wernick, I'm curious to hear, because cabinet confidence is certainly an interesting and challenging subject, because and you highlighted in your opening statement that dynamic that needs to be, that balance that needs to be found, ensuring that we have there's respect for the process, but also ensuring that Canadians have answers from their top elected officials. So I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on what would be an appropriate balance to ensure that there is accountability and access to cabinet confidence.
Well, citizens, taxpayers, and voters have information on all of the outputs of government. They see the results of the decisions, the announcements, the procurement contracts, the awarded grants and contributions, the audits, the evaluations, the research studies, and so on. So all of the outputs of government are available to Canadians, and a lot of information about what government does. In fact, there's been more information available to Canadians than probably any time in our history. The frontier of the discussion is about the deliberative processes before decisions are taken. And my point is that if there is not a degree of confidentiality for those deliberative processes before a decision, you will impair the ability of cabinet to take decisions.
Okay, and Mr. Lapointe, would you have anything to add to that?
I would agree with Mr. Wernick that, of course, in the point of deliberations before decisions are reached, cabinet confidence is, of course, quite apt. I would argue, though, for an earlier disclosure of the inputs after the decisions are taken than there is today.
Yeah, I actually agree with Mr. Lapointe on a 10-year rule. 10 or 12, something like that would be perfectly adequate now.
My final question, Mr. Wernick, one of the concerns that I've certainly found is that decisions are often made beyond the official briefing notes and the official correspondence. And it was mentioned before about text messages, phone calls, messaging apps that can circumvent accountability mechanisms like access to information. I've requested audio recordings that were in fact promised and have never received them. So I'm wondering, in your experience, your unique experience in government, have you ever seen these other fora of communications detracting from the system being able to ensure that there's that public's access to information?
Well, I think the bigger issue, Mr. Couric, is that there is an entire nervous system of political staffers that work for ministers in the Prime Minister's office who are equal partners, and in some cases the most important partners in the decision-making process. So you have an act which only covers the public service, and that record is available after the fact. And then the political side is basically under an invisibility cloak. Hence my recommendation that the act be extended to taxpayer-funded staff who work for ministers.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Couric. Et aussi pour l'information de la committee, on a reçu.
We received Mr. Wernick's document for the information of the committee, but there was a translation issue. We'll be receiving the translated documents tomorrow. So that was a bit of an issue for the committee today, but we'll receive it tomorrow.
Up is Ms. Hepner for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And through you, I would like to direct my questions to Kirk Lapointe, who was my boss and I believe the editor-in-chief at the Hamilton Spectator when I worked there back from 1999 to 2001. And I can attest that it's true that you have long you've long been a proponent of the ATIP or FOI system. And I've told this committee on a number of occasions that back in those days, we had a mandate. We had to file a certain number of FOIs every week or every month, and I think that was your decision. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about why the volume of FOIs, why it's so important to a journalist to be able to access information that way.
Thanks very much. It's also good to see that one of us has had an advancement in a career. The reason is that so much of information is staged for us today. So much of journalism is actually, taken from whatever is laid in front of us. And then there's also a certain amount that we have to react to, whether it's a tragedy or an event of some sort where we have to simply be there to respond and be the chroniclers of that. And I don't think there is enough room in the public sphere for material that is of a journalist's own basic initiative. And I think that access to information, freedom of information in the provinces, as it's called, is an opportunity for journalists essentially to devise what it is that they believe the public wants to know and then go about getting it without necessarily being just at the trough of what governments will lay out before us. It also sheds important light on sometimes a bit of a chasm between what the public is told and what is really happening. And then lastly, I think it also serves as a bit of an instrument for the public to have input into journalism to demand certain things from us and to go and seek the information that the public wants. And without it, I don't think that we come close to even approximating the activities of government because it then in a system that's absent a very effective ATIP, we're left with a system that is largely rolled out and orchestrated, choreographed by governments of the day. And I don't think that is anywhere near the service that the public needs.
Thank you. And the system has changed quite significantly since those days. So since Bill C-58, we've eliminated all fees beyond $5 application fee. There's a system of proactive disclosure from ministers' offices, ports, other government institutions. And back in the days I was at the Spectator, we would get a summary of how much it would cost to fulfill our requests. Sometimes it was hundreds or thousands of dollars, and then we would just drop it. So would you say that with the changes this government has brought in, the government has become more open and transparent in some ways, or can you reflect on the changes since those days?
Yeah, I used to say that the system was cumbersome, confusing, and costly, and now it's just cumbersome.
And do you understand why that might be? I think there's been a huge increase in the numbers of FOI requests. You can now make your request online. You don't have to fill out those little pages that we used to have to do and send it off by snail mail. It's a lot faster. It's a lot easier to do. Would you feel that it would be a better system if the government could respond to people, say, within 30 days, but without fulsome information? Or would it be better from your perspective if the government had more time to respond to these requests and respond more fulsomely?
I'm in support of, I think the Information Commissioner has basically said that there ought to be a cap on the amount of time that a delay can take place. I would be open, I think, as I think most journalists would, to partial disclosure, to kind of a rolling file that would come out. Certainly a certain amount during the 30-day window would be really important. But ultimately, I think what we have to stop are these incessant delays that appear to delay, in a lot of cases, the important research of access to information for months and sometimes many years. That has to be something that I think this committee is very firm upon in order to make sure that we really are getting a new culture introduced inside the public service to respond quickly.
We heard from the information commissioner at this committee that she has the ability to approve institutions declining bad faith requests, and she thinks that this power should be used more often. Do you think that would help?
It's a pretty subjective term, bad faith, as are terms like vexatious, and I would certainly not want to give a blanket to that without understanding quite clearly the criteria. I did see some of the criteria of the information commissioner around this, but I would certainly hold the fort on that before seeing a pretty extensive list of criteria to ensure that really what we're getting there are truly vexatious requests.
Thank you. I only have a couple seconds left, but just quickly, are you concerned at all that if we remove the number of exclusions that are now with the ATIP system, that it would make government more closed off, that people would find other ways to communicate so they wouldn't have to be subject to the legislation?
It's definitely a worry, as has been the introduction of technology to let public and political staff obviate normal requests. I think, though, that it can be countered to some degree with a much wider amount of proactive disclosure of certain records.
Thanks.
Merci, Madame Hefner.
Thank you, Madame Hefner. We're moving on now to Mr. Simard. You have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. A quick question for Mr. Lapointe. In your opening remarks, you stated that the government's action could cause people to doubt them and become cynical with their political participation because they don't have the relevant information to make informed decisions. And I don't know if you saw that today, but there was an article in La Presse by Émilie Bergeron, which states that following an ATIP request, she saw in some Treasury Board documents that the matter of access to information was not a priority. These are documents from Treasury Board which show that access to information is not a priority for public servants. And I would like to know, in your experience, if that is quite generalized in the federal government, if in most departments is that idea that it's not a priority something that is quite common.
Well, I'll defer to Mr. Wernick in a second here, but in my experience in dealing with the law now, dating back to, as I say, more than 30 years, I would say that there still exists a very strong culture of protecting the bureaucracy, in some cases of protecting the political masters. And I understand that crosses, that is a very broad generalization, probably unfair to a great number of people who I think are excellent advocates within the system of disclosure and are basically fighting for public access to the right to know. But in my experience, at least anecdotally, and on the basis of the thousands of requests that I've had some kind of hand in, it still is a culture that prevails.
Je sais pas si Monsieur Wernick.
Mr. Wernick, do you have anything to add?
Just pour renforcer.
Just to add to some of what I've said.
Required under the Access to Information Act, there is an infrastructure of document management, storage, and retrieval that feeds requests under the Privacy Act, discovery and litigation proceedings, public inquiries, written parliamentary questions from and requests from House committees and Senate committees, and examinations from over a dozen officers and agents of Parliament. So there are lots of people involved in the management, storage, retrieval of documents and records within the Government of Canada. It is quite an undertaking. I would say that if you want to impose deadlines and penalties, you're pushing on a rope unless there is a lot more investment and care and attention to the issue of records and document management by future governments.
OK. Je vous comprends bien.
Understood. So beyond having more resources, there is a question that keeps coming to mind. For example, what happened over the summer. I don't know if you followed the FAZAT or the group received 200 pages of redacted documents. They had waited so long to receive them. And I would like to know, with the current act, who is accountable? So there is the question of accountability. People are responsible for their actions. So for information, how could we assure accountability for decision makers? Would it not be the ministers that should be responsible for information that is shared or not shared?
Non, par contre, je pense que
No. It's the obligation of a deputy minister to have a process in place. And we don't want to have the minister's interference in the decisions with how to treat an ATIP request.
Donc, il faut.
So there should be a distance between politicians and cabinet politicians, and that burden needs to be on deputy ministers, for example. Question: could there be a policy, for example, for people who have a tendency to not share this information to get themselves out of problematic situations? We know that decisions are made behind closed doors. If I look at ATIP requests, it takes a long time to receive an answer, and the matter has time to be forgotten before receiving an answer. So how could we ensure that there is accountability for departments that don't respond to ATIP requests? Answer: there are report cards and investigations, and the commissioner can give comments, and on second step, there are committees like yours.
And I will say that a couple of things that we've used to do that we don't do any longer. We used to ask under the Act for the process of responding to requests and how long those requests would stay in a deputy minister's or even a minister's office before coming to us. So it provided a little bit of accountability that way, a bit of shaming if that was necessary. And then I think journalism in general, we often go away quietly when we don't get what we want, and it's our fault. I think we ought to be telling the public a lot more about what we don't receive when we request.
One of the things that could be covered by the proactive disclosure provisions that I'm recommending would be that departments and agencies would have to post every single request that has been filed and every request that has been disposed and the elapsed time. And that would create a feedback loop.
See, Monsieur Warnick, Monsieur Lapointe, Monsieur Simard. Peter, Julian, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses, Mr. Warnick and Mr. Lapointe. You are giving us very relevant information for the work that we have to do as a committee.
Start with you, Mr. Lapointe. You did an interview a few years ago in the Courier where you talked about Hamburg, Germany's transparency law, which creates, as you know, that legal obligation to disclose information and puts the onus on those who don't want a document released to argue against its release, as opposed to those who do want a document released to argue about why it should be released. How would this approach have an impact on access to information nationally? And is this the kind of approach that you think should be implemented federally?
Well, it would be the ultimate judo move. I love the approach that they're taking. They're still having troubles in Germany with that approach because an awful lot of companies have raised their hands and said that there's a great deal of commercial confidence that is potentially leaking into the system. But it would clearly put the onus where I think initially that it was designed to be, which was that governments needed to make the argument on why things can't be released, as opposed to and third parties would have to make the arguments why they can't be released. Otherwise, there would be an automatic disclosure.
But the commercial confidence is because the onus is to protect that information. That's something that companies, of course, can advocate for, keeping that confidential.
Yes, they have that full right.
Yeah. Are there any other countries or jurisdictions that you believe Canada should emulate when we look at access to information legislation? Other best practices worldwide?
I've used the American law hundreds of times, and I think there is just simply a different culture of disclosure in the United States with its government. There is I think, kind of an inherent, whether it's libertarianism or it's a certain suspicion of the power of government, and so as a result, I think it's freedom of information law, which predates ours. I think it goes back to 1971. Is a far more fulsome provider of information to the public. We often, as journalists, will ask for the same information on both sides of the border when there is a cross-border issue, and the Americans always come out on top in terms of providing information. So at least I like many aspects of the American law and its culture.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Now, what aspect of the access to information regime currently do you believe creates the most barriers for journalists in this country?
Oh, I don't know. I think there's a 15-way tie for first place on that one. I don't know that there's necessarily one that is the barrier. It used to be costs. It now I think would be delays, because the Act seems to serve as a slightly better tool of history than of journalism. I think that in some cases, even the disclosure of all requests by individual departments serves as a little bit of an impediment, because it permits other researchers, other journalists to see what has been requested. And so as a result, a great many investigative works that are done by journalistic organizations will try to find other ways to secure that information and access to information, so as not to essentially tip off the competition about what is going on. But it's a small price to pay if the larger reward is that we get faster service in all of this. So I would say delays now are the largest issue for us.
Okay, and you've lived and worked right across Canada. Do you see any regional variation? For example, being in British Columbia, do you see access to information playing out differently in the regions, or does it have the same impact right across the country?
Well, when it comes to the cabinet confidences, in British Columbia, they're 15-year confidences. They're not 20 years the way they are federally. And that permits us to go and look at records that cabinet would have deliberated on or decided upon earlier. And so we can go back only 15 years in this. But I will say that one of the central problems is that outside of that Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa window, the law isn't used all that much out here. I mean, my counterparts out here barely use the federal law. We use the provincial and and the municipal laws here in order to gain access to information. And I think that should tell us something, that there is generally a belief that the law doesn't work, and so it's not worth trying. The distance between the two centers. It used to be that I could walk into someone's office and talk about the request that I had with them, and deal with them, locally on something. Now, of course, that's just an impossibility 3 time zones away. And I think other journalists out here, other researchers out here, just shrug and just don't use the law.
That's very helpful. My final question, because I know the chair of the committee will be shutting me down shortly. Should more information be provided to Canadians on how the process works, how to handle responses, so that generally Canadians can also have a better understanding of the access to information regime and how to navigate it?
I teach it, and I can tell you that in 3 hours, it's very difficult, even with graduate level students, to walk them through the process. I can only imagine what it's like for a typical citizen to try to wade through all of this. And so tutorials, any number of videos, any number of how-tos, I think would be helpful for the average citizen to try to work through it. And I think that, quite honestly, there ought to be almost the equivalent of a help desk in order to help people frame their requests so that they're going to be well received. I have had instances, and I know of instances where groups of public servants have gathered around a request on a table and decided what were the words that were essentially tripwires to permit them to not disclose material. And I think that, again, something that would assist the public in order to do it. We have all kinds of other government help desks to help you file your taxes, to do a number of things. Okay. This ought to be one of those as well.
Thank you, Mr. Lapointe. That was a little bit more time than usual, but nous allons procéder maintenant avec...
We're now going to move on to our second round. All of the members will receive 5 minutes to ask questions. We'll start with Mr. Gould, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being with us today. It's very important to hear from you. In the government's process, well, they make decisions every day. And when Canadians or journalists want additional information on certain decisions, they use access to information requests. But unfortunately, too often, responses don't have a lot of substance or are redacted. Sometimes there's information that is redacted that would not even be that bad to share. Often when people explain themselves, they're often told that they were right, but to hide all this information leads us to understand a blackout towards the public service. And we can start with Mr. Vernick. Are there abuses in hiding so much information?
I think that people in good faith in the departments are trying to comply with the requests and then sort out the various exemptions and reasons why there would be a need for confidentiality or withholding. It could be legal advice. It could be something like evidence in a harassment complaint, evidence given by residential school survivors in an adjudication hearing, tax returns, business, there are all kinds of reasons. Actually, I do agree with Mr. Lapointe that the onus of the law could be flipped to disclose unless and justify that, but that means you need some precision about definitions around national security, cabinet confidences, and so on. But I do think the regime could be flipped over. I do want to make the point that journalists are not the only users of the Act. They're, of course, an important one. Ultimately, this is for citizens, voters, and taxpayers. But the Act is heavily used by brokers and resellers. It's used by lawyers suing the government. It's used by lobbyists and special interests trying to block a government initiative or torque legislation or regulation. It's heavily used by businesses trying to get information on their competition, and it is used by foreign governments. So we can't be completely naive about the purposes of access to information requests and the need to do careful screening at some point in the process. But I do agree it could be flipped over to an onus to disclose unless.
Yeah, and I would agree with Mr. Bernick about, of course, the usage. I would say, however, that probably one of the reasons why journalists only comprise around 10% of the user base of the law, is that they feel a frustration with it, and they largely just don't try.
Vous avez présenté.
In your opening remarks, you shared recommendations. Are there 2 or 3 that you would like to see in our committee's recommendations? Which would be the most important?
Alors, selon moi,
I believe that the 2 most important ones would be to have a regime of transparency and to have a legislative framework for proactive disclosure.
curtailing or making exemptions from all of these practices of proactive disclosure. You should put it in the law, make it painful to repeal and painful to backslide. So I think adding proactive disclosure to the Act would be helpful. I agree with Mr. Lapointe, giving the Commissioner a help desk function would be useful to assist Canadians in making requests. And I think it's very important that the Act be extended to taxpayer-funded political staff.
Monsieur Lapointe.
Mr. Lapointe?
I would just simply repeat a couple of them that I think are the most important ones. One has to do with the sense of delay and the investment that's necessary in order to make sure that there is an infrastructure to make the provision of the law more efficient. And then the second part, I think, would have to do with proactive disclosure across a wider range of documentation records to make sure that largely there is that journalists and other researchers don't have to resort to using the law for things that ought to be rather routinely available.
Merci, Monsieur Gould.
Thank you, Mr. Gould.
Ms. Sachs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm actually going to follow along the lines of my previous colleague. Both Mr. Wernick and Mr. Lapointe, you both mentioned that not only journalists are accessing ATIP requests, but it could be historians, researchers, individuals who are looking at legal cases. And Canadians have lots of questions, not just about the issues of the day, but the historical issues of the past when they file for ATIP requests. And, in August of this year, B'nai B'rith actually put out a statement that it had requested an ATIP request about Nazi war criminals who had potentially entered Canada and whose names had been reviewed under the Deschênes Report Commission in 1985, and requested and put in an ATIP request for all of those names and the background information of that report. And their request was denied, deeming it unreasonable because it would take an estimated 1,285 days or more than 3.5 years to answer the documentation of their request. So here we have a situation of historical record and archives. And I'm just wondering, either Mr. Wernick or Mr. Lapointe, whoever would like to start, do you have any suggestions of how we manage requests like that, or which are of a historical interest to communities or also potentially of legal ramifications?
Well, no government that I've ever worked for has really taken record storage, management, or retrieval seriously. I worked as the deputy at the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, and we're often called upon in litigation and other proceedings to go back to documents from the last century and the century before. I don't know how you imagine that government record keeping works, but it's scattered across over 300 organizations, thousands of workplaces, different technical formats. Some of it's in paper, some of it's in the software of the 1970s and 80s. And there has never been a serious investment in digitizing and catching up on historical records. So they are the hardest to manage and retrieve. They don't lend themselves to scanning for search words and keywords. And there's a very expensive, labor-intensive manual process involved in going back to anything that's more than about 20 years old.
I mean, it's my hope that as we start to get greater and greater machine learning and AI, I know that we're seeing some research out here on the West Coast from our universities about how certain documents will be able to be scanned and read with it, but we're still some time away. I think all you can start to do now is to build a better system that is going to enable better record keeping, more clearly accessible record keeping, and then have to catch up later on with what has been filed across, as Mr. Vernick puts it, 300 different organizations.
Thank you to both the witnesses. You know, barely a month before this news release by B'nai B'rith, the Information Commissioner, Special Report and Library and Archives did make light of an interdepartmental working group to advise on proactive declassification of historical records as part of its thought process. But again, it's almost like it's all being funneled through this one channel of ATIP. Would there be any wisdom of having, you know, some kind of classification process of priority records or types of records being asked for so that they could be better managed, especially when it's interdepartmental communications that are being thought for, or historical records? Any thoughts to that?
Well, I think you could weave some of that language into a proactive disclosure chapter of the Act. If there is a part of the Act that covers proactive disclosure and there is an onus to disclose unless you can provide a reason not to, I think a lot of that would, subject to the limitations of the record system, I think some of that would speed up considerably.
Mr. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, having used National Archives many times, probably there is some kind of a relationship between ATIP and archives law to facilitate perhaps a greater declassification of records as they enter the archives.
Chair, how much time do I have?
30 seconds or more.
Okay, I'm going to cede my time at this time.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Sachs. La prochaine est Monsieur Simard.
Mr. Simard, 5 minutes, please. Thank you very much. Mr. Warnick, in your opening remarks, you talked about changing the Information Commissioner's role to a transparency role. And you talked about changing legislation as well for disclosure to be more proactive. You also stated that the mandate for that transparency office should be broader. So I understand, but what do you mean by having a more broad mandate? I think that we could look to the Privacy Commissioner.
Not being shy about conducting studies and issuing reports and commenting on the privacy practices of government entities and indeed private sector firms. So I think it's entirely possible to give a specific mandate to the Transparency Commissioner to conduct ongoing studies and make recommendations on the continuing improvement of transparency practices. And my view is that it should cover the entire federal public sector, not just the executive branch departments and agencies, but also all crown corporations, Parliament itself, and the courts, all of which are part of our system of governance.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lapointe, earlier you said something. You said that journalists only represent 10% of the federal legislation use, and in a response to Mr. Julian, you stated that perhaps the provincial and municipal legislations were better made and more used than the federal legislation. Do you have any data that would allow us to compare? Are there more journalists that will use provincial and municipal legislation rather than the federal legislation?
Yes, there is. There's some data to that effect. In British Columbia, I think journalists use the law here upwards of 35 to 40% of the time. But I can understand entirely the reasoning in behind all of this, and I think some of it has to do with distance and the relationship of local government and provincial government to any news organization. There are national organizations that focus in Ottawa, Montreal, Toronto in particular, that would have a more acute interest in national affairs. And so I can understand where they would be the ones using the law there, and in various provinces across the country, you would see local and regional organizations using the law locally.
OK. Je vous pose cette...
Thank you. I'm asking you this question because you talked about having an office for assistance, and I wonder if the federal legislation is more complex in its way of doing things than something similar at the provincial level, rather. And if that is the case, there could be a way to support and help people who would like to use the federal ATIP legislation. Is the federal legislation more complex?
Well, don't get me wrong. I'd be very happy to see a help desk at a provincial and even a municipal level too. But I would say that that a lot of it has to do with just the vast array of records at a federal level, and the fact that many of them don't have as concrete a relationship to a community as would provincial or municipal records. And I think that in itself directs journalists away from taking a look at national issues when you're in one of the regions of the country. I think that there's obviously far more focus on federal matters in the capital and in Montreal and Toronto, the larger business centers of the country.
Monsieur Simard.
Thank you, Mr. Simard. Next, Mr. Julian, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Merci, Mr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Warnick, I apologize that we weren't able to see your brief, and as the chair mentioned, we'll be able to see it tomorrow. So if the information is already in your brief, you can let us know.
To ask you about, since you indicated agreement both with Mr. Lapointe on the idea of a help desk and also on the idea of reverse onus, to what extent you think that having that reverse onus and disclosure would help to increase the ATIP process, improve it? And secondly, the question I asked to Mr. Point I'd like to ask you, which is what are the models that you see internationally that Canada should be looking at? You mentioned, and I quoted the word, I've got it in yellow and circled, shambolic, how we do records management. So I appreciated your comments on that. Is that part of the problem, that compared to other countries, we don't do a good job of managing documents?
I don't have at my fingertips any international comparisons. Frankly, I don't think any government probably does a great job on records management. It's just not something that politicians are attracted to investing in. It's seen as overhead. It's seen as bureaucracy. There's much more priority given in times of growth and in spending reviews. Every time a spending review happens, and I've lived through many operating budgets being cut, priority is given to externally facing services to citizens, and things that get cut are internal services like finance and audit and records management, because they aren't seen as investments in better service. They're just seen as overhead, and I think that's a big mistake, and I hope it'll be avoided in the next spending review, which is inevitably coming just like winter. I would make the point, though, that there are areas of the federal government that provinces aren't heavily involved in that require a careful consideration of national security. Provinces, for the most part, don't do a lot of international negotiations. They aren't involved in international conferences and discussions. They aren't taking positions at international bodies. The federal government has to be very conscious of that, and there are federal areas that are immensely interesting to foreign governments and their agents. And so I think some screening about not making it easier for the Chinese or the Russians or the Iranians to interfere with Canada would have to be taken into consideration in the drafting of these provisions. But I think there's a lot of room for proactive routine disclosure. The hope was a long time ago, and I remember the discussions, that proactive disclosure of procurement opportunities, contracts, grants, contributions, travel, hospitality, research studies, audits, evaluations would eventually reduce the demand on access requests, and it never happened because people have moved upstream to the deliberative processes of government, and they want to know about things before decisions have taken place. I guess I'd ask you to think that a request is not a request is not a request. Some of them are extremely focused and they know what they're looking for, and it's relatively easy to decide whether it should go out or not, or to apply the screens. But there are also requests formed, particularly by the brokers and resellers, which are kind of like the trawl nets that go over the ocean floor, scooping up everything that lives. I used to get a monthly request when I was a deputy minister for every note that I had ever sent to the minister, that month. And ministers are often there are often those kinds of requests for every communication between person A and person B going back the last 5 years, including all text messages and all emails and so on. So these create a lot of challenge in going back, and a lot of the effort put into processing requests is in these trawl net requests for everything that can be found. And the resellers and brokers then approach people and say, here's something that would be interesting to you.
Just coming back then to that reverse onus, if you're supportive of proactive and mandatory disclosure, what are the documents in addition to the ones you've just mentioned that should be mandatory to disclose or proactively disclose? In other words, can you add to that list that you just gave us?
I think it's up to, you can either hardwire them into the legislation or give the commission, or you can create a list that you can add to, through regulation. That's up to you to decide how to construct it. But I would say that, the government tomorrow could roll back any of the practices around posting travel, hospitality, procurement, contracts, grants and contributions, public opinion research. I would like to see, requirement to post final audit reports, final evaluation reports, any research studies commissioned by taxpayers, any scientific research paid for by taxpayers. You'll recall that there was an agreement reached with government scientists about the muzzling of research a few years ago. That could be repealed or revoked. You could see some of that transparency around scientific research put in legislative language. And I'd like to see all of the results of any environmental testing, product testing, health testing, and safety inspections would have to be posted. And those are some examples, and I'm sure the committee could come up with others.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Warnick. Thank you, Mr. Julian. We're going to go to, for 5 minutes, to Mr. Keurig.
Thank you very much, and it's been very, very informative. So thank you for this. And my question, and I'll ask both of you, but I'll start with Mr. Warnick. Redactions. I've received access to information requests where 40 pages will be redacted, and it will reference the act, and then you have 40 pages, which can, in some cases, include an entire document that is not available. So I guess my question is quite broad, but how do we make sure that that redactions are done properly, and that it's not being done to avoid accountability when it comes to the public's right to know? Mr. Warnick, I'll start with you, and then Mr. Lapointe.
Well, I think whether it is a request-based model where something is released, or something is released unless there's an argument not to. Redaction is the process of separating, from the releasable from the unreleasable. It does require the exercise of judgment and interpretation of the law and the practices. So I think the first screen should be clarity and definitions. So very precise and clear language and definitions, which could be updated from the 1980s version of them. To catch up with current practice. And then I think you have to give the commissioner a role in challenging and overseeing and having the ability to call out what he or she sees as inappropriate redaction. At the end of the day, you can go to the federal court, and the courts would have the final say on a lot of issues. I believe the federal court should have the final say on any issue to do with whether cabinet confidences are involved or not. And my recommendation, you'll see in the brief, is that the definition of cabinet confidences is far too broad right now.
Okay, thank you, and I do want to hear from you, Mr. Lapointe. But just to follow up, Mr. Wernick, the need for resources for the information commissioner. We've heard from a number of witnesses saying that it's all well and good to have the ability to make orders, but if there's no meaningful, or if there's not enough resources to ensure that that's a meaningful process, or that those in the conflict of interest commissioners, the access to information commissioner's office don't have the resources to meaningfully follow through on those things, that's problematic. Do you have any comments on that briefly, and then I'll get to Mr. Lapointe?
Well, it's ultimately up to Parliament to decide how much to appropriate, and you have a range of officers and agents and feedback loops from the Information Commissioner, the Privacy Commissioner, the Auditor General, the Parliamentary Budget Office, the Official Languages Commissioner, Conflict of Interest Commissioner, the Lobbying Commissioner, the Integrity Commissioner, and on and on and on. So there are about 3,000 people and about $40 million invested in watchdogs. And that doesn't go to the people that work in departments and agencies actually having to chase down in computer systems or filing cabinets or old archives, paper documents. So there is, the private sector uses a term cost of sales or cost of productions. There is a cost of transparency within the federal system, but you have the power of the purse and you have the ability to affect the appropriations and supply to those agencies.
Okay, thank you. And about a minute, Mr. Lapointe, if you have something to add.
Well, my world record for redacted document was a 2,700-page one. Got lovely new sheets of paper to put into my fax machine, and at the time. But I would say that it does invest in empowering the Information Commissioner to have greater oversight, and if necessary, then to perhaps have a small agency, a small board, a small adjunct to the Information Commissioner's office in order to help arbitrate redactions so that the public interest is served better.
Thank you, Mr. Keurig. We are now going to go to Mr. Baines for 5 minutes. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our guests for joining us today. I'm going to go to Mr. Wernick first. I think you briefly mentioned something about the federal court. One of our previous witnesses, Monsieur Drapeau, suggested changes to the Information Commissioner to help speed up the process of ETHI, specifically to introduce a 1-year period before complaints can be brought before a federal court. What are your thoughts on his analysis?
I don't have enough knowledge to recommend. I mean, I think that some sort of reasonable period for disclosure, especially if something is being subject to proactive disclosure, should be accommodated. But I'm not in a position to offer what that cutoff should be. The federal court is not a place you can just go and get a ruling tomorrow. It's a busy place dealing with all aspects of federal law, and so. Yes, they do expedited hearings, but you be careful what you wish for. You may just be clogging up the federal court if there's too easy an access to it for smaller matters that perhaps could be solved through some sort of dispute settlement mechanism or an intermediate body, as Mr. Lapointe suggested. I find I'm agreeing with him an awful lot this afternoon.
Okay, thank you for that. And with reference to Bill C-58, it allowed proactive disclosure of many tens of thousands, in fact, of pieces of information that previously required access to information requests to obtain. Do you believe this has helped make government more open and transparent to Canadians at all?
Well, I left government 3 years ago, so I think you're in a better position to judge that based on the feedback. I do think it is the model to be expanded to a much longer list of categories of information, and that if information is getting to voters, taxpayers, and citizens directly without intermediation, that's a good thing for the transparency and accountability of the federal government.
Okay, thank you. And I'll move on to Mr. Lapointe. You've been an adjunct professor and executive in residence at University of British Columbia as Graduate School of Journalism program since 2004. So what do you teach your students, if anything, about the access to information in Canada and the role of journalists?
develop patience, be further accepting of rejection as part of the craft. What I try to teach them is that it is still an important pursuit. I believe that it is one of the more sophisticated ways in order to do your research, because you're really depending on the actual official records. So you're not depending on someone's interpretation of them, anecdotal comments. You're not just chatting somebody up in order to get an opinion on what it is that's going on. You're actually dealing with that. So I teach them to be applied. But I will say that year after year after year, we, in the course of the 3 hours, we actually file requests with them. And I've yet to see in I guess the dozen or so years that I've been doing this exercise to have one of them come back in anything less than about 90 days, and with anything approaching something that we could convert into a story. So it's a frustrating thing, and I think a lot of my students are one and done with ETHI, and that is a great regret.
Just further to that, in this era of misinformation, disinformation, and maybe like how it's important to be first and getting the information out, has this, delays in the ETHI, maybe contributed to, journalists maybe not being able to get the most accurate information out?
Well, I think that that's true, because I think we're dependent on the interpretation of the information providers in the interim before you see the official record. But I will say that where our craft makes its mistake is that we cover too much and uncover too little. And access to information is a way to uncover things. And I don't mean that in a nasty, harsh way. I think that it really does provide some kind of disclosure of important information. And I don't think that journalism does that often enough. And I think one of the reasons has to do with the complexity of this law and the fact that it is very difficult to use. And as I said earlier, it's a better instrument of history than it is of journalism.
Okay, and I think Mr. Warnick talked about other jurisdictions. You also mentioned Germany, but are there other areas that other jurisdictions that we can learn from that may be doing this better in a way?
Well, I think Canada now has been ranked in the last survey I saw somewhere around 57th or 58th in the world.
No, that's
so
not
it's,
right. That's
is that number?
No.
What is the world? I haven't seen the latest world ranking.
So sorry, but I actually think that's a good answer to the question, which is you should go to some of the international ranking scores. I could send the committee a list of them, but in rankings of most transparent countries by U.S. News and World Report, Canada was second out of 85 countries. Open Data Watch ranks Canada 15th. And the Rule of Law Index from the World Justice Product ranks Canada on open government 13th out of 140. That's not to be complacent. We should aim to be ahead. The countries, I did look at all of these over the weekend. The countries that are ahead of Canada on transparency are basically the Nordic countries, New Zealand and Switzerland. And so if you go to some of those international rankings, you'll find examples to follow.
Okay.
Most of them are small unitary states without significant provinces, but that may be an anomaly.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Warnick. Sorry, Mr. Lapointe. Just a final thought, if you like.
Yeah, I was going by the global right to information rating. And in the last one I have, which was from 2019, Canada was ranked 57th.
Thank you, sir. All right, that completes the second round of questioning. We are going to go to the third round. As I mentioned, it'll be 5 minutes for the two sides and then 2.5, if that's okay. Je pense que ça sera le dernier.
I think that will be the last round of questions. We received a lot of information.
Colleague, Mr. Kurek, having any questions. I'm going to take the liberty of asking a question because, Mr. Warnick, you said earlier the record management system is scattered across 300 organizations. You spoke about digitizing and catching up on that. I could certainly speak to that in my role as Veterans Affairs critic and how difficult it is, the transfer of documents from active service to Veterans Affairs. Oftentimes we were told there was no digitization of those documents, so that they'd actually have to go to the National Archives and grab the information on paper to determine whether an injury, for example, was attributed to service. You also mentioned that it was very expensive and labor intensive. Just how expensive and how labor intensive would that be, and how much of a necessity is it? I'm seeking your guidance on that.
Well, I think there are different aspects of government. There are 300 departments and agencies. You can see them all on GC Infobase, which I hope you've all bookmarked, which lists all of the federal entities, their budgets, their people, and their activities, and so on, which is an important transparency tool, by the way. So there are areas like Aboriginal Affairs and Veterans where it's obviously relevant to go back 30, 40 years in history to deal with adjudication claims or litigation or other issues. Other areas, not so much. If a patent has been awarded, the patent's been awarded, and on we go. So I think it will vary. There are places that generate enormous amounts of records, like the Revenue Agency or Border Services. You will remember when you got on an airplane, and to enter the Canada, you filled out one of those blue and white paper cards with your customs declaration. I mean, what do you think happened to those cards? I mean, they had to go somewhere and be read and filtered and so on, and so on. So it's a wide-ranging sort of area. I do think that the Chief Information Officer at the Treasury Board should be given a much clearer accountability for records management and should have to do an annual report, which this committee could examine, because I do want to make that point. You can have all the sanctions and deadlines and obligations you want, but you're pushing on a rope if the systems for storage, retrieval, classification of documents and records, which are increasingly in the form of emails and texts, are not invested in. And I have yet to work for a government that's invested seriously in records management.
So in terms of the human resources required for digitization across all of these organizations, and you mentioned about the cost, but you didn't put a value to it. Any idea how much that would cost?
I would suggest that you ask the Archivist of Canada. And what happens is that departments store things in filing cabinets and storage rooms. I remember looking at this during the Harper government's deficit reduction plan, that something like 15 to 20% of government real estate was used to store filing cabinets and records. And there was a hope that digitizing them would free up real estate and real property. But there's a labor cost of actually going, retrieving, sorting out, applying the exemptions, sending those up the line. The higher you go up the line, you're dealing with the scarce time of senior managers who have the sign off on the final release and so on. So it's certainly a large number in terms of the cost of servicing this function. And it's scattered across. It isn't the ATIP shop. The ATIP shop will coordinate the request and chase people down, ask for them to retrieve things, remind them of their obligations, but it'll end up in, I don't know, the Regina office of the department or some line function of Veterans Affairs and so on. And so it's incredibly uneven out there because different budgets and different histories, the capabilities in records management and retrieval. And my understanding of it is as more and more things are created, and there's more being created than can be processed by the archives and library and the people that work in that area. So, but if you want a cost estimate, I think maybe talk to the National Archivist.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wernick. And here I was thinking every time I filled out those custom forms that they didn't go anywhere, but apparently they do. So, thanks again.
I'm not sure they were, but they were collected and sent somewhere, along with a lot of other records. So.
The value of what you have to declare, $200 every time I came back. Yeah. Ms. Khalid, you have 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chair. I'll start with Mr. Wernick. Mr. Wernick, you've made some really interesting remarks today. I really appreciate your differentiating the focus on transparency as opposed to request-based ATIs. Now, you had also mentioned that political staffers should be opened up to ATI, but you also have said that cabinet confidence is a necessity. So can I just ask you to unpack that a little bit? What kind of communication would a political staffer be able to provide that a bureaucrat talking specifically on policy or on decision-making, that would not be sufficient enough, that we would need to go further towards having a political staffer also be ATIP'd? I would love your thoughts on that.
Sure. I mean, cabinet and its committees is a fairly easy to identify zone. There is cabinet, there is committees, which include Treasury Board, and you can know what the agendas and the papers and the deliberations of those cabinet processes are. Political staff and ministers' offices take part in the whole upstream process of sorting out options and advice. They meet with each other, they meet with public servants. There are plenty of interactions, in the process of, well, what are we going to do about this issue, or how are we going to respond to that report? And so there are public servants involved in the conversations and the advice function, and there are political staffers. But the regime only really brings out, that part which is public servant to public servant.
Thanks for that. I'll just turn to Mr. Lapointe. As a man who's a person who's had a vast experience in the media, I really want to understand a little bit better with the changing role of media, what journalism looks like in today's day and age with blogs and with just so much information out there. How does access to ATIs, do you think, does it hinder, like true journalism? Is it a proponent of true journalism? Where does subjectivity or vexatious or frivolous claims fall in within that whole category? I know that you had mentioned subjectivity and interpretation of documents, and sometimes I'm sure you've received thousands and thousands of documents on an issue, and you could shape a story to whichever way you'd like it to be shaped based on what's in the document and what's not in the documents that you've received. So I'd love to hear you kind of unpack that a little bit. My apologies, that's a really loaded question, but anything you can provide as insight.
Yeah, let's spend the next 4 or 5 hours here. First of all, there is no such thing as objectivity, right? I mean, it's a bit of a myth about journalism. There are, however, objective methods. We teach objective methods in order to do your research. And one of them has to do with primary sources, which come through documents and interviews with particular people. And some of them are secondary sources that involve interpretation. What I'd say in terms of ATIP's contribution to journalism is that, as I said earlier, we cover too much and uncover too little. And I think that we do ourselves a disservice with the public by having so many voices on somewhat the same announcement, the same issue. We don't diversify our report. We don't see it as a necessity every day to provide people with things that they didn't know, things that weren't shaped or provided to them. And I think that ATIP can serve an extremely useful role in that. However, given the resourcing of most newsrooms today, which is much smaller than they were 10, 15, 20 years ago, it is that much more onerous to break through that. And given the fact that governments have done, I think, an excellent job of staffing themselves up, of finding sophisticated communications people in order to present the image that they wish, the information that they wish, to de-emphasize or even exclude the information they don't want disclosed. We're losing the battle, I think, in journalism in terms of, against governments or any institution that wishes to provide information. And so ATIP is one of our potential assets in this battle, I think, to have disclosure. And I just wish that there were a freer system of disclosure, something that was more easily accessible and that we were able to provide more of it to the public, because the public is increasingly cynical, distrustful of media because of bad information that gets provided, and often on the basis of rumors and of second-hand information. And these kinds of documents, these kinds of records, are in fact far more empirical and far more persuasive in their fashioning in terms of helping to understand how decisions were made and how policies were formed. I just wish that we had more access to it, and that it was far more facilitated and a greater investment in behind it to make sure that had happened in a timely way.
Yeah. Thank you.
Monsieur Lapointe, merci, Madame.
Thank you, Ms. Khalid. Thank you. Mr. Simard, 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much. You stated something interesting earlier, Mr. Lapointe. You said that in the last 12 years, you had an exercise of making requests and none of them were returned to you in the 90 days. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, with the students that I teach, we have an exercise where we provide about 3 or 4 of those requests in the course of the 3 hours that I'll teach them.
I find that quite surprising that in 12 years that the success rate of the governments is not very good for those 90 days. Do you find that there are some departments that are more difficult to deal with than others in giving information? And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but for the context of climate change, for example, did you have trouble receiving information from the Natural Resources Department? Or for immigration? I don't know if in your experience there are some departments that are more opaque than others?
Well, in my experience, the people who are in ATIP branches are there for one of 2 reasons. One, they're tremendous advocates for the public and disclosure, or the other side is that it's a bit of a way station for them to move on to something else. The changeover in those branches is often very high, and as a result, the continuity in those organizations can be lacking. So I don't have any specific ones because I've dealt with a variety of agencies over a 30-year period, so I can't attest to one being so well and one being so poor. But I would say that one of the challenges that we face is that we're often dealing 6 months later with a whole other batch of people than we were earlier when we're doing some research at my organization.
I don't know if the practice has changed, but I certainly remember that the commissioner used to issue report cards and give people an A or a B or an F. And
That's right.
That certainly created a feedback that you did not want to get an F. You wanted to at least get a gentleman's C or something like that. So I think that is a role that the commissioner can play of giving that kind of evaluation and feedback, and that would put pressure on agencies to perform better.
J'aurais une dernière.
I would have one last question, Mr. Lapointe. And I don't want to bring you into something that would be too polarizing, but you talked about the objective method, that we can't be completely objective, and I agree, but the objective method that you're trying to develop with your students, you mentioned that. And I have seen journalism and activism being set kind of against each other, and I would like to hear what you think about this, the links between journalism and activism.
Well, again, it's a long answer, but I'll shorten it as quickly as I can here. The Academy, in particular, now speaks of the activist journalist as an element of information provision, where as long as you declare conflicts, as long as you let the audience know where you're coming from on a particular issue, that you can, in fact, have a more activist role in society than the traditional journalist might have had. It's not my favorite ilk of the business, but I recognize that it exists.
Monsieur Simard.
Thank you, Monsieur Lapointe and Monsieur Simard. Mr. Julian, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes, or perhaps a little more, if you would like. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
For both of you and your very compelling witnesses. The United Kingdom's Freedom of Information Act, which identifies the proceedings of Cabinet and its committees as falling under a qualified exemption, so that the public interest has to be considered in each case. Should Canada follow a similar model where if there is a public interest to have the proceedings of Cabinet or committees publicized, that is something that would allow for that information, again, on the basis of public interest, to be disclosed? How do both of you feel about that?
Well, I think it raises the question, who decides what's in the public interest?
I would agree with that. I think that the only onus that I would put is that legislation has in the past, at a provincial level at least, compelled disclosure of matters that are a threat to public safety in certain environmental cases and other cases where that becomes the default position. But I agree with Mr. Wernick. That is one of the great quandaries of all time, is who decides.
I think ultimately you have to, in our system of government, rely on the courts. And if matters are arbitrated, the federal court can decide whether withholding a redaction was unreasonable, and the federal court can weigh the various interests, including national security and so on. It's very subjective as to whether it's in the public interest, and there are other mechanisms for feedback on government, such as the judicial inquiry, which is unfolding before our eyes this week, or people litigating and taking the government to court. And all of those officers of Parliament, from the Auditor General to the Privacy Commissioner, the Lobbying Commissioner, to the Accessibility Commissioner, the Integrity Commissioner, do get access to various forms of government information and provide valuable feedback on how government is serving Canadians.
I have a follow-up question, again, for both of you, and that's around the issue of records management. Putting aside the issue of funding, what are the other recommendations that you might both have in regards to records management, and in regards as well to institutional oversight of the whole access to information regime, so that we can improve access to information to Canadians?
I think my whole argument is not to put aside the issue of funding, and not to put aside the issue of training, not to put aside the issue of how do you manage information in the digital age. How would we apply artificial intelligence and learning software to do document retrieval and so on? It requires a considerable investment, not just in information technology, but in people and training. And I think it requires a feedback loop so that it doesn't automatically drift down towards the bottom of the priority piles of government or of Parliament.
Yeah, my concern is that too many horses have left too many stables here when it comes to the way that information now can be transmitted. And I would say, again, I don't think it's in the remit of this committee to take a look at wider public service and political aid behavior, but I believe that there has to be some teeth put in somehow in order to make sure that that provision of information and record keeping, the important footprints of our history, are not in the smartphones of political aides and public servants.
Well, I think that is possible, actually. You saw the UK example with Suella Braverman and using unauthorized software and so on. You could hardwire into legislation a power by the Chief Information Officer to sign off on the choice of software and devices used for government business. And you could put in sanctions for communicating government business on unapproved software and devices. That's something the Americans do. You may recall the Hillary Clinton affair. So that could be imported into Canadian law, so that if you are communicating off book on apps like Signal and WhatsApp or so on, that you would know that you were breaking the law.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wernick. Thank you, Mr. Julian. So just ahead of us concluding here today, I've been advised by the clerk that the document that Mr. Wernick sent in has been translated, and I believe it has been shared with the committee. So I want to thank you for that, Mr. Wernick. Seeing no other discussion or questions, I just want to say thank you to both our witnesses today, Mr. Wernick and Mr. Lapointe, for providing the committee with valuable information. I want to thank the committee members for their questions. We are going to resume study of this issue on Wednesday of this week. We're just confirming our witnesses, but I want to say thank you to all our committee members and particularly our witnesses for being here today. Thank you, gentlemen, both for being in front of the Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics Committee.
Thank you. It's been a privilege.
Thank you for the invitation and for the flexibility to do it online. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a real privilege. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, the meeting is now adjourned.